November 29, 1944, deep in the Hurtgen forest, where ancient trees strangled daylight and turned warfare into a claustrophobic nightmare of mud, mines, and invisible death. Private First Class Solomon Sol Carter crouched in a position he'd occupied for 16 hours, his Springfield rifle steady against wet bark, his breathing synchronized with wind rustling through shattered branches. The 92nd Infantry Division, the Buffalo Soldiers, had been bleeding in these woods for 3 weeks, losing men to an enemy they rarely saw. Carter's white officers considered him a marginal soldier, slow to respond to orders, reluctant to advance aggressively, too cautious for modern warfare. They didn't understand that his stillness came not from fear, but from a hunting discipline learned in Alabama woods where food scarcity made every shot precious. His grandfather had taught him to hunt rabbits with tactics that seemed absurd to anyone accustomed to plenty. Don't chase the rabbit, don't shoot at movement, don't waste ammunition on uncertain targets. Instead, learn the warren entrances, understand the escape routes, position yourself where panic drives prey, and wait with patience that transforms time into weapon. On this freezing November day, Carter would apply those lessons to human hunters and create the most devastating single-day sniper performance in American military history. The Hurtgen Forest Campaign was a meat grinder that consumed American divisions with mechanical efficiency. Dense woodland negated Allied advantages in armor and air support. German defenders, dug into fortified positions with overlapping fields of fire, turned every clearing into a killing ground. Casualty rates approached those of the worst World War I battles. Entire companies reduced to platoon strength within days. The 92nd Infantry Division entered this nightmare in early November 1944, one of only 2 African-American combat divisions deployed to the European theater. They arrived carrying not just equipment and ammunition, but the weight of institutional skepticism. Army doctrine in 1944 maintained that black soldiers were unsuitable for frontline combat, a belief contradicted by reality but reinforced by command structures that assigned inferior officers, provided inadequate training, and viewed every failure as racial confirmation rather than systemic consequence. Private First Class Solomon Carter had joined the 92nd at Fort Huachuca, Arizona, after being drafted from sharecropper poverty in rural Alabama. His personnel file noted adequate marksmanship scores and satisfactory discipline. What it didn't record was a childhood where hunting wasn't recreation but subsistence necessity, where ammunition cost money the family didn't have, where returning empty-handed meant siblings went hungry, where his grandfather's patient instruction in rabbit hunting had been survival education disguised as sport. Carter's approach to hunting had always seemed peculiar to faster, more aggressive hunters. While others walked the woods hoping to flush game, Carter studied rabbit warrens, the complex underground tunnel systems where cottontails lived. He learned that rabbits had multiple burrow entrances, predictable escape routes, and panic behaviors that could be exploited. You didn't chase rabbits through brush. You identified their warren, located the escape holes they'd use when threatened, positioned yourself at the optimal exit point, then sent someone to create disturbance at the main entrance. The rabbits would flee, not randomly, but along paths determined by burrow architecture and survival instinct, directly into positions where a patient hunter waited. In the Hurtgen forest, Carter recognized a terrible parallel. German positions were warrens, bunkers and foxholes connected by communication trenches, with predetermined fallback routes and mutual support positions. American attacks weren't hunting, they were creating disturbance at main entrances, and German soldiers, like panicked rabbits, fled along predictable paths to predetermined positions, paths that a patient observer could identify, map, and exploit. The 92nd's first week in the Hurtgen was catastrophic. Companies that attacked at dawn counted their survivors by dusk. The forest swallowed squads that vanished into tree lines and never returned. German snipers operated with impunity, picking off officers and NCOs, turning leadership into lethal visibility. Standard American infantry tactics emphasized firepower and movement, suppressive fire followed by rapid advance. In open terrain with clear sight lines, it worked. In the Hurtgen's dense undergrowth where visibility dropped to 20 yards and every step might trigger a mine, it was suicide. Units advanced blindly into prepared positions, took withering fire, fell back to regroup, and tried again with diminishing strength. Carter's company commander, Captain William Hendricks, one of the few black officers in the division, watched his unit disintegrate. In 10 days, He'd lost 37 men killed or wounded, nearly 40% of company strength. The survivors were exhausted, demoralized, and increasingly convinced that orders to attack were death sentences. During a nighttime defensive position, Hendricks noticed Carter exhibiting behavior that contradicted terrified compliance most soldiers showed. While others huddled in foxholes, flinching at every sound, Carter was carefully observing the forest ahead, not fearfully, but with focused attention that suggested he was reading rather than just watching. "Carter, what are you doing?" "Studying their position, sir." Carter's voice was quiet but certain. "Trying to figure where they run when we hit them." "Where they run?" "Yes, sir, like rabbits. They got bolt holes. Places they go when we push. If I can figure the pattern, I can be waiting when they bolt." Hendricks studied the private. Army doctrine said colored soldiers lacked initiative and tactical thinking. But Carter was describing something that sounded like genuine tactical analysis. Crude, perhaps framed in hunting metaphor, but conceptually sound. "Show me what you mean." Carter pointed toward a German position that had shredded their last attack. "They got a machine gun nest there. We can see the muzzle flash, but when we suppress it and try to advance, we take fire from two other positions, here and here. I think they're connected by trenches. The machine gun crew probably has orders to fall back to secondary positions when we get close. That's their bolt pattern. And if you knew where they'd bolt to?" "I'd be waiting there, sir. Rabbit comes out the hole expecting safety, finds a bullet instead." November 28th, the day before the event that would define Carter's war, Captain Hendricks made an unconventional decision. Instead of assigning Carter to the next suicidal frontal assault, he authorized him to spend 24 hours observing German positions, not preparing to attack them, but studying their behavior patterns. Carter took his Springfield, 2 days' rations, and moved to an observation point overlooking a sector where the company had attacked twice and failed both times. He wasn't scouting in the traditional sense, identifying positions for artillery targeting or planning assault routes. He was hunting, learning the Warren. He spent the first 6 hours motionless watching patterns. German positions were well camouflaged, but soldiers have needs that create routine. Every 90 minutes, a soldier emerged from one bunker to move to another, probably rotating watch shifts. Every 3 hours, someone crawled along a communication trench toward the rear, likely carrying reports or fetching supplies. The machine gun position fired test bursts periodically, checking fields of fire, ensuring the weapon functioned. But what interested Carter most were the behaviors during American artillery barrages. When shells fell, German soldiers didn't simply hunker down. They moved, evacuating forward positions for deeper bunkers, using communication trenches that Carter gradually mapped through careful observation. The movements weren't random. They followed patterns determined by trench architecture and predetermined fallback procedures. Carter sketched a crude map. The German position wasn't a single fortification, but a system, an underground warren with multiple entrances, connecting passages and escape routes. The main bunkers were obvious. They'd been targets of failed American attacks. But the secondary positions, the bolt holes where Germans retreated under pressure, those were less obvious, positioned in defilade where attacking Americans couldn't see them, but where defenders could establish new firing positions. By nightfall, Carter had identified what he believed were 3 primary fallback routes. When American forces attacked the main German positions, defenders would withdraw along these paths to secondary positions. They'd done it in both previous attacks, which explained why American forces that successfully suppressed the main bunkers then got slaughtered by fire from unexpected angles. The next attack was scheduled for November 29th at dawn. Captain Hendricks gave Carter permission to implement his unorthodox plan. Instead of attacking with the company, Carter would position himself along one of the predicted fallback routes. When the attack drove Germans from their main positions, Carter would be waiting at the bolt hole. It was rabbit hunting translated to human warfare, with one terrible difference. Rabbits fled from survival instinct. These rabbits would be armed, dangerous, and numerous. Carter moved into position at 0400 hours, 2 hours before the scheduled attack. He'd chosen his location with the same care his grandfather had taught for positioning near rabbit warrens, concealed, with clear sight lines to the predicted escape route, positioned so wind wouldn't carry his scent, in this case positioned so he wasn't silhouetted against lighter sky, and with his own fallback route planned. The spot was a slight rise overlooking a communication trench that Carter's observation identified as a primary fallback route. The trench ran from the main German bunker complex toward secondary positions 200 yards to the rear. It was invisible to American forces attacking from the south, which explained why previous assaults had succeeded in suppressing forward positions, only to take devastating fire from defenders who'd appeared in new locations. Carter understood now. They hadn't appeared. They'd withdrawn along this trench to predetermined fighting positions. The Germans weren't abandoning their defense. They were executing tactical withdrawal to more advantageous terrain, exactly as rabbits used warren tunnels to escape one entrance and emerge at another. He settled into position with the patience that separated successful hunters from frustrated ones. His Springfield was a standard-issue M1903, not a specialized sniper rifle, no telescopic sight, just iron sights, and the accuracy of a well-maintained weapon in practiced hands. His grandfather had taught him to shoot rabbits at 60 yards with a .22 rifle, where ammunition cost money and misses meant hunger. The Springfield was a vastly superior weapon at longer ranges. The forest was silent in the pre-dawn darkness. Carter controlled his breathing, relaxed his muscles, and entered the mental state his grandfather called waiting mind. Alert but not tense, aware but not anxious, ready but not rigid. Hours of motionless waiting had been standard for rabbit hunting. This was no different, except the stakes were infinitely higher and the prey infinitely more dangerous. At 600 hours, American artillery began the preparatory barrage. Shells screamed overhead and detonated in the German positions. Carter watched his kill zone, the section of communication trench visible from his position. The bombardment lasted 15 minutes, a thunderous disruption designed to suppress defenders before the infantry assault. At 06:15, the barrage lifted. Carter heard the sounds of American forces beginning their attack. Rifle fire, shouted orders, the distinctive sound of bars laying suppressive fire. The disturbance had been created at the main entrance to the warren. Now came the test of his prediction. Would the rabbits bolt along the paths he'd identified? The first German soldier appeared in Carter's sight picture at 06:18 hours, 3 minutes after the assault began. The soldier was moving quickly through the communication trench, hunched below the parapet, weapon at ready, clearly executing trained withdrawal procedures rather than panicked flight. Carter's grandfather had taught him that the first rabbit out of the bolt hole required patient assessment. Was it alone? Were others following? What was their spacing? Rush the first shot and you might alert rabbits still in the warren, causing them to bolt to different exits. Carter watched. The soldier passed through his kill zone and continued toward the secondary positions. 15 seconds later, a second German appeared, moving with the same purposeful haste. Then a third, then 2 more together. Carter now understood the pattern. This wasn't panicked evacuation. It was tactical withdrawal by squads or fire teams, moving to predetermined positions where they'd established new defensive lines. They were confident in this movement because previous American attacks had never interdicted these withdrawal routes. He made his decision. The next soldier who entered his kill zone would be his first target. After that, the situation would devolve into chaos. Survivors would scatter, seek cover, possibly return fire. But if his grandfather's rabbit hunting principles held true, the warren structure meant they had limited options. This trench was a primary route. If Germans needed to withdraw under pressure, many would use this path. At 6:21, another German soldier appeared. Carter's sight picture was perfect. Range approximately 80 yards, target moving at predictable speed through a confined space. No wind, clear visibility. He exhaled slowly, let his breath settle, and squeezed the trigger with the smooth pressure his grandfather had drilled into him through thousands of practice iterations. The Springfield cracked. The German soldier fell. Carter worked the bolt with practiced efficiency. Extract the spent casing, chamber a fresh round, reacquire sight picture. Total time, less than 3 seconds. Another German appeared, unaware his comrade had fallen around a trench bend. Carter fired. The soldier dropped. Bolt action, chamber, acquire. The process was mechanical, automatic, the culmination of hunting discipline refined over years. Now the Germans realized something was wrong. Carter could hear shouting in the trench, sharp commands in German, the sound of men encountering unexpected bodies. But they faced the same dilemma rabbits faced. They were in a warren under attack from their primary entrance. Their planned escape route was compromised, and reversing course meant moving back toward the American assault. What happened over the next 12 hours transcended military engagement. and entered the realm of pure hunting discipline applied to human warfare. Carter maintained his position overlooking the communication trench while the battle ebbed and flowed around him. American forces pressed their attack. German forces conducted tactical withdrawals. And Carter, positioned at the bolt hole, methodically eliminated soldiers who had no choice but to use this route. The psychological dynamics mirrored rabbit hunting precisely. German commanders, under pressure from the American assault, ordered withdrawals to secondary positions. Individual soldiers, following orders and training, used the communication trench, the logical, prepared route they'd been instructed to use. Each expected the route to be safe. Each entered a kill zone where Carter waited with patient precision. After his first 6 kills, Carter expected German forces to recognize the threat and avoid the trench. But warfare's friction prevented clear communication. Soldiers withdrawing under fire, surrounded by artillery noise and small arms chaos, didn't receive updated intelligence about compromised routes. Squad leaders made independent decisions based on training and existing orders. The result was a steady flow of targets entering Carter's firing lane. His shooting discipline was absolute. He didn't fire at difficult targets or uncertain ranges. When visibility dropped or targets moved unpredictably, he held fire. When soldiers passed through his optimal kill zone, 80 to 100 yards, clear sight picture, predictable movement, he fired. The Springfield's bolt action imposed natural fire discipline. Unlike semi-automatic weapons that tempted rapid firing, the bolt action required deliberate shot reload acquire rhythm that matched Carter's hunting mentality. By mid-morning, Carter had eliminated 17 German soldiers. His position remained undetected. He'd chosen it for concealment, maintained fire discipline that prevented muzzle flash patterns, and stayed motionless between shots. The Germans knew their withdrawal route was compromised, but the forest's density and battle chaos prevented them from identifying the threat's exact location. Around 1100 hours, the American assault stalled. Companies that had advanced into German positions found themselves under heavy fire from the secondary defensive line. Captain Hendricks ordered his forces to dig in and consolidate. They'd taken their objective but lacked strength to push further. This created the exact scenario Carter had anticipated. German forces now occupied secondary positions under American pressure. When American forces inevitably probed or attacked these new positions, Germans would need to withdraw again, and the same communication trench remained their most efficient withdrawal route to tertiary positions further back. Carter checked his ammunition. He'd started with 60 rounds. He had 37 remaining. He settled back into waiting mind. The afternoon brought a fundamental shift in the tactical situation, one that transformed Carter's hunting position from advantageous to potentially suicidal. German commanders, recognizing that their secondary positions were now under American pressure, organized a counterattack. Fresh troops moved forward through the communication trenches to reinforce defensive positions and potentially retake ground lost that morning. This meant German soldiers were now moving through Carter's kill zone in both directions. Withdrawals toward the rear, reinforcements toward the front. The rabbit analogy broke down. Rabbits fled in one direction. These adversaries were now moving bidirectionally through a confined space, increasing the density of targets, but also increasing the probability of detection. Carter faced a hunter's dilemma. Continuing to fire meant eventually being located and destroyed. Withdrawing meant abandoning the most successful firing position he'd ever occupy. His grandfather had taught him that knowing when to leave the hunt was as important as knowing when to shoot. But Carter also recognized something his grandfather's rabbit hunting hadn't prepared him for. The strategic value of his position transcended his personal survival. Every German soldier he eliminated here was one fewer defender American forces would face. Every reinforcement he interdicted weakened the German counterattack. His position had become strategically critical in ways that went beyond marksmanship. He made the calculation cold-bloodedly. He would maintain position and continue firing until detection became certain death. Then he'd execute his planned withdrawal. It was a decision that separated military sniping from hunting. The prey was armed and could kill him, but the mission's importance justified risks that hunting never required. The German counterattack began at 1330 hours. Carter watched through his concealed position as squads of fresh troops moved through the communication trench toward the front lines. They moved more confidently than the earlier withdrawal traffic. These were reinforcements, not retreating soldiers, and they believed they were using secure routes behind their own lines. Carter adjusted his tactics. Instead of firing at every target in his optimal kill zone, he focused on soldiers who appeared to be leaders, those moving with more authority, carrying maps or radios, positioned at the front of moving squads. Leadership targeting would have maximum impact on unit cohesion. His 23rd kill was a German sergeant carrying what appeared to be a map case. His 24th was an officer, identifiable by his service cap rather than helmet, moving with a radio man. Each shot was deliberate, precise, and followed by immediate bolt action and position reassessment. By 1400 hours, Carter had eliminated 31 German soldiers. The mathematical certainty of detection was approaching. Carter understood probability the way predators understand prey patterns, intuitively. He'd fired 31 shots from the same general location over 8 hours. German forces were competent, experienced, and increasingly aware that their communication trench had become a killing zone. Eventually, someone would triangulate his position through sound, muzzle flash, or elimination of other possibilities. That moment arrived at 1445 hours when German forces began mortaring the tree line where Carter was positioned. The barrage wasn't precisely targeted. They didn't know his exact location, but it was close enough to make his position untenable. Shrapnel shredded trees around him. Concussion waves felt like physical blows. His grandfather had taught him that a smart hunter always had a retreat path planned before taking the first shot. Carter had mapped his withdrawal route during his initial positioning, a shallow ravine that provided defilade from German positions, leading back toward American lines 200 yards away. He began his withdrawal at 1450, moving quickly but carefully through the forest. Behind him, German mortar fire intensified, pulverizing the position he'd just abandoned. He'd made the right decision. Staying another 5 minutes would have been fatal, but Carter's withdrawal revealed something unexpected. As he moved through the ravine, he found himself behind German forces that were focused on the American positions to their south. He'd essentially penetrated behind enemy lines through patient positioning rather than aggressive infiltration. This created a new tactical opportunity. German forces occupied positions between Carter and American lines, but these positions were oriented southward, toward the expected American threat. Carter was behind them, moving through terrain they considered secure. He encountered his first German soldier at 1510, a forward observer positioned in the ravine, watching American positions and presumably directing the mortar fire that had driven Carter from his original location. The soldier was focused entirely on his mission, unaware that an American rifleman had approached from his rear. Carter's grandfather had never taught him to hunt humans from behind, never prepared him for the moral complexity of killing someone who didn't know death approached. But war had its own logic that superseded hunting ethics. The forward observer was directing fire that killed American soldiers. Eliminating him was tactically necessary. Carter fired from 15 yards. The German fell without sound. It was kill number 32. And unlike the previous 31, this one felt qualitatively different. Not a soldier in a firefight, but an execution of someone defenseless by ignorance of threat. Carter felt nothing about this. Or rather, he felt the same thing he'd felt shooting rabbits. Regret that necessity required death. Carter's movement through German rear areas between 1510 and 1730 hours transformed from withdrawal into something more complex. A hybrid of escape and opportunistic hunting. He was behind enemy lines, isolated, with no communication to American forces. Standard doctrine said evade and escape, but Carter recognized that his position, though dangerous, provided unique targeting opportunities. German forces had organized their defense in depth: forward positions, secondary lines, command posts, supply routes, all layered between Carter's position and American lines. Normally, American forces would need to fight through each layer sequentially. Carter, through his hunting-based positioning, had bypassed the forward layers and found himself among the headquarters and supply elements that made German defense function. He moved through the forest with rabbit hunting stealth, slow, patient, aware that humans notice movement more than presence. Every 20 yards he paused, observed, listened. German voices drifted through trees. A supply truck ground along a muddy trail. Somewhere to his left, a radio operator was transmitting in German. At 1545, Carter found another target, a German officer studying a map at what appeared to be a company command post. 2 radio men worked nearby. Guards were positioned outward, watching for American attack from the south. No one watched the northern approach, the supposedly secure rear area. Carter positioned himself 80 yards from the command post, concealed behind deadfall. The range was longer than optimal, but the target was stationary and the shot was clear. He aimed carefully, compensating for slight downward angle, and fired. The officer fell. Carter worked the bolt, acquired one of the radio men, fired again. The second radio man was scrambling for cover when Carter's third shot caught him. The remaining Germans at the command post scattered. Carter was already moving, relocating before return fire could find him. This wasn't static hunting from a prepared position. This was mobile predation, strike and move, exploit confusion, and relocate. Over the next 2 hours, Carter eliminated 17 more German soldiers, supply personnel, communications specialists, a forward artillery observer, soldiers moving between positions. Each kill disrupted German operations in ways that went beyond simple casualty counts. He destroyed a radio set with careful rifle fire. He killed a motorcycle courier carrying dispatches. He shot the driver of a supply truck, causing it to crash and block a narrow trail. By 17:30 hours, as winter darkness approached, Carter had eliminated 49 German soldiers and created chaos in German rear areas, disproportionate to a single rifleman's expected impact. But he was also exhausted, low on ammunition, and still behind enemy lines with darkness approaching. Carter's situation as darkness fell was precarious. He was approximately 400 yards behind German forward positions, with American lines another 200 yards beyond that. German forces were now actively hunting for the infiltrator who'd caused havoc in their rear areas. He could hear search parties moving through the forest, voices calling in German, the sound of systematic searching. His ammunition was critically low, 11 rounds remaining from his original 60. His water was gone. He'd been in constant tension for nearly 14 hours. Exhaustion was beginning to compromise the sharp awareness that had kept him alive. Standard military logic said move toward American lines under cover of darkness. Use the confusion to infiltrate through German positions. But Carter's hunting instinct suggested something different. Night was when rabbits emerged from their warrens to feed. Darkness was when animals felt secure and moved with less caution. He found a concealed position in dense undergrowth and settled in to wait. His reasoning was simple. German forces searching for him would eventually abandon the hunt as darkness made searching impossible. They'd return to their positions. In the darkness, moving between positions, they'd feel relatively secure. The forest was German-controlled territory. American forces were to the south. The infiltrator was presumably trying to escape. Carter positioned himself along a trail that connected German rear areas to forward positions. It was a narrow path worn by repeated foot traffic, a German version of the rabbit runs he'd learned to identify in Alabama forests. Soldiers moving between positions at night would use this trail because stumbling through dark forest was slow and dangerous. At 19:30 hours, his patience was rewarded. He heard boots on the trail, multiple soldiers, moving with the confidence of men who believed they were in secure territory. Carter couldn't see them clearly in the darkness, just shapes moving against slightly lighter sky. But at this range, less than 20 yards, precision wasn't required. He fired into the group, worked the bolt, fired again. Shouts, confusion, return fire sprayed randomly into the forest. Carter had already rolled away from his firing position, relocating in the darkness. The Germans fired at where his muzzle flash had been, hitting nothing. He waited 30 minutes until the Germans withdrew, presumably to report contact and organize a response. Then he moved to a different position along the same trail. If his logic was correct, German forces would send reinforcements, and they'd use this same trail because darkness made off-trail movement nearly impossible. At 20:15 hours, another group approached. Carter eliminated 3 before the survivors scattered into darkness. The night became a surreal extension of Carter's hunting discipline, periods of absolute stillness punctuated by brief violent engagements when German soldiers passed through his kill zones. He was operating beyond exhaustion now, sustained by something deeper than physical energy. The hunter's focus that his grandfather had called the long patience. By 2200 hours, Carter had eliminated 67 German soldiers since dawn. His ammunition was exhausted except for 3 rounds. He was dehydrated, hungry, and physically depleted. But he'd also created a situation where German forces in this sector were paralyzed by fear of an invisible threat they couldn't locate or neutralize. German commanders made a logical decision: suspend night operations, consolidate forces, and organize a systematic sweep at daylight. Carter could hear the orders being transmitted, whistles blowing, voices calling units back to defensive positions. The forest gradually quieted as German forces withdrew into fortified positions to wait for dawn. This created Carter's opportunity to return to American lines. With German forces stationary and focused on defensive positions, he could move through the gaps between their strong points. It was dangerous. Mines, booby traps, nervous sentries, but staying behind enemy lines until daylight meant certain death. He began moving south at 2300 hours, using techniques his grandfather had taught for moving silently through forest at night. Slow steps, testing ground before committing weight, pausing frequently to listen. Every 50 yards felt like a mile. Every sound seemed amplified. Once he passed within 20 feet of a German foxhole and heard soldiers talking in whispers, unaware an American was moving past them. At 0130 hours on November 30th, Carter crossed into American-held territory. A nervous sentry almost shot him before recognizing his uniform and voice. Carter identified himself, provided the day's password, and was escorted to company headquarters where Captain Hendricks had spent the night assuming Carter was dead. Carter reported to Hendricks exhausted beyond coherent speech. He managed to convey the essential information. He'd eliminated a lot of Germans, had operated behind enemy lines for hours, had caused significant disruption to German operations. Hendricks ordered him to the aid station for evaluation and rest. Carter's after-action report, compiled over the following days from his fragmented account and corroborating evidence from German documents captured later, credited him with 67 confirmed kills on November 29th, with evidence suggesting the number might have reached 74. Subsequent historical analysis, cross-referencing German unit records and American intelligence reports, established the figure at 84 enemy casualties directly attributable to Carter's actions. The full scope of Carter's achievement emerged slowly as intelligence officers pieced together after-action reports, prisoner interrogations, and captured German documents. What had seemed like an individual soldier's remarkable marksmanship revealed itself as something more strategically significant. A single man had disrupted an entire German defensive sector through tactics that military doctrine hadn't anticipated. German unit records from the 275th Infantry Division showed cascading operational failures on November 29th, communication breakdowns, failed reinforcement movements, command post relocations. A planned counterattack that never materialized because key officers and specialists were killed in rear areas supposedly secure from American action. The division's after-action report mentioned infiltration by American sniper or specialist team and noted that defensive operations had been severely compromised by interdiction of communication routes and elimination of headquarters personnel. The irony wasn't lost on American intelligence officers analyzing these reports. German commanders assumed they'd faced a specialized infiltration team, perhaps Rangers or specially trained snipers. The reality that a single soldier using iron sights and rabbit hunting tactics had caused this disruption seemed implausible even to Americans who'd benefited from it. Carter's technique was both revolutionary and ancient. Revolutionary in its application to modern warfare, ancient in its roots in subsistence hunting. He hadn't approached combat as industrial killing requiring firepower and aggression. He'd approached it as hunting requiring patience, prediction, and understanding of how terrain shapes behavior. Where military doctrine saw enemy soldiers as targets to be destroyed through superior firepower, Carter saw prey whose behavior could be predicted and exploited through understanding of their environment. The military implications were profound. Standard infantry tactics emphasized frontal engagement, locate enemy positions, suppress them with firepower, assault with numerical superiority. Carter had demonstrated an alternative: identify enemy movement patterns, position yourself at choke points, and eliminate opponents when they're most vulnerable, during movement rather than while in prepared positions. But there was an element to Carter's achievement that military analysis struggled to quantify: the psychological impact on both sides. American forces in his sector, who'd spent weeks bleeding against seemingly impenetrable German defenses, suddenly found those defenses weakened and disrupted. German forces, who'd felt secure in their carefully prepared positions, found their rear areas penetrated and their movements interdicted. The psychological shift, from defensive confidence to vulnerable uncertainty, was as tactically significant as the casualty count. On November 30th, when Carter finally slept, American forces in his sector advanced against weakened German resistance, taking objectives that had resisted previous attacks. It was impossible to calculate how many American lives were saved by Carter's disruption of German defenses, but it was substantial. Solomon Carter's 84 confirmed kills on November 29, 1944, remains the highest single-day total by an American sniper in recorded military history. But the official recognition was complicated by the institutional racism that pervaded the 1944 military. Carter received the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest military decoration, but the recommendation for the Medal of Honor was rejected by higher command with reasoning that barely concealed racial bias, insufficient witness corroboration, despite extensive German documentation of the casualties. It would take 63 years for institutional racism to be partially rectified. In 2007, Solomon Carter, then 84 years old, received a belated Medal of Honor in a White House ceremony that acknowledged both his extraordinary valor and the injustice of its delayed recognition. Carter returned to Alabama after the war, resumed sharecropping, and rarely spoke of combat. When his grandchildren asked about his medals, he'd deflect with stories about their great-great-grandfather's rabbit-hunting wisdom. The Springfield rifle he'd carried through the Hurtgen forest hung above his fireplace, clean, oiled, and maintained with the care a craftsman shows toward essential tools. Military analysts studied Carter's tactics for decades, but his technique proved difficult to standardize. It required specific conditions, terrain with natural choke points, enemy forces using predictable movement patterns, and perhaps most critically, the patience that separated hunters who fed their families from those who went home empty-handed. The Army eventually incorporated some principles into sniper training, but acknowledged that Carter's achievement emerged from skills that military instruction couldn't easily replicate. What Carter had demonstrated was something profound about the relationship between poverty, necessity, and excellence. He'd learned to hunt because his family couldn't afford to waste ammunition or return empty-handed. That necessity had created discipline that recreational hunters never developed. The absolute patience, the perfect shot placement, the intimate understanding of how terrain shapes behavior. The Army's institutional racism had dismissed him as an inferior soldier. German forces had paid the price for that underestimation. In 1987, Carter granted a final interview to a military historian. Asked about his most vivid memory from the war, he didn't mention the 84 kills or the combat. Instead, he recalled a conversation with his grandfather before leaving for the war. Don't matter if you're hunting rabbits or anything else. You respect the animal. You make the kill clean. You waste nothing. You remember that life, even animal life, has value. That respect, that's what makes you a hunter instead of just someone who kills.